Hello, folks. It's Professor Gaida here to talk to you today about point of view, perspective, and structure in fiction. So let me show you what we are talking about to begin with. So I'm going to start off by referring to some resources that you have on our Brightspace site. They are on the course texts and links page, which is on the content page, right? And if you scroll down to the fiction writing textbook folder, you'll see that you have all these nice resources for helping you learn about the elements of writing fiction. The elements we're going to talk about today are point of view and perspective. And so I'm going to refer to some of these and structure and refer to some of these as we talk about those things today. I'm going to start off by talking about point of view and perspective. When in storytelling and fiction writing, there are basically just a few sort of technical points of view that you can have. One is first person point of view. That is a story told by a character in the story or an I. The character, the narrator then is somehow involved in the story, in the action of the story, in the plot. The other type, or another type, is second person point of view, where the narrator speaks to a you, the reader, right? Or you somehow maybe meaning another character in the story, but there is a you constantly referred to. This is a fairly unusual point of view in fiction writing, but it is sometimes used. It has a distancing effect. It kind of it makes the story seem very intimate and at the same time artificial, which is why it's sort of rarely used. It has a strange effect on readers. So there's first person, there's second person, and then there's third person, which, like first person point of view, is also very common. The difference is that a third person narrator is not involved in the story. The narrator stands outside the action of the story, is not a character. Now, there is a hedge involved in using third person. There can be. You can have a third person narrator who stands outside the story and tells it objectively. That is, he or she can only tell the story in terms of what happens, literally the action. We can't know any of the character's thoughts. That's one kind. That's called third person point of view, objective perspective. Then there's the limited perspective, or otherwise known as single character or multiple character perspective, where the narrator's outside of the story, not involved, but can at different times know and express what a character in the story is thinking, or maybe what a couple of the characters in the story are thinking at different times about what's happening. The last kind that you'll see commonly is the third person omniscient perspective. That is an all knowing narrator who can know and express what all the characters are thinking at different times, and even more, can know even more than any single character knows, can have almost a godlike knowledge of the world that this fiction unfolds in, right? So those are your options for point of view. And you should link your choices to the kind of story that you're telling, right? And the way you want to tell it. And you should be willing to experiment. If you try writing a story in first person and you don't like it, try writing it in the third person. It may work out better for you, right? It may suit the story better. Okay, let's look at some examples. I'll start with the second person since it's so rarely used, and I'll just say that you have a link to this story on the in the flash fiction folder. You have a link to 25 stories that use, and they use different points of view and perspectives. And so this is a story that you have a link to called Taylor Swift, and it's written in the second person. And you'll see what I mean when I say that there's a you involved in the second person. You're in love. It's great. You swipe on your phone and order. The next day, a Taylor Swift clone shows up at your house. Okay. So you can see that's a very intimate and at the same time kind of off-putting narrative technique. So you can use it, but just be aware that it is not so commonly used. Then there is the first person in a story that we discussed in class called Sticks by George Saunders. And the story is about this dad who has this pole in front of the house. And we talked about how he dresses the pole and then, what happens when his kids are young and then when they're older. Now, the narrator is one of the children. So she's involved in the story. Therefore, she is a first person narrator. So this is an example of first person narration, right? First time I brought a date over, she said, "What's with your dad in that pole?" And I sat there blinking. So actually, it's a male first person narrator. This is an excerpt from the Harry Potter novels, and it's an example of third person narration, right? A breeze ruffled the neat hedges of Privet Drive, which lay silent and tidy under the inky sky, the very last place you would expect astonishing things to happen. Harry Potter rolled over inside the blankets without waking up. One small hand closed on the letter beside him, and he slipped on, not knowing he was special, not knowing he was famous, not knowing he would be woken up in a few hours' time by Mrs. Dursley's scream as she opened the front door to put out the milk bottles, nor that he would spend the next few weeks being prodded and pinched by his cousin Dudley. He couldn't know all that. So this is a good example, actually, of the third person omniscient perspective, where the narrator is not involved in the action. She talks about Harry and the other characters, but she can know what they're thinking, and she can also know more than they know. She can know things that are going to happen to them before they happen, which, if you think about the nature of the Harry Potter stories, suits those stories because there's kind of a magical element to them, more than the characters can know. Okay, and just sort of a brief little discussion of structure to go along with our discussion of point of view and perspective. When you choose a point of view and perspective, you also will eventually need to choose a structure to tell your story. And, probably most people will choose a chronological structure. Story moves in time from beginning to end. But that's not the only structure you can possibly choose. You could also use a non-linear structure. So you can move back and forth through time. The narrator can move the events, can move you, the reader, back and forth through time, right? Let's say you have a third person narrator with a single character perspective, and we get to hear what that character is thinking in the middle of a scene. Suddenly, that character's memory could take you back in time to a past scene. And then that scene plays out, and then we could jump back to the present. You could even jump to the future, right? Depending on the nature of the story. So that idea that you're not bound by chronological time is another way to tell the story. Yet another is this circular idea where you begin the story at the ending, and then the rest of the story sort of shows the reader how we got to this ending, takes them from beginning back to this ending. So it's a circular pattern. And then there's a parallel structure where you could have two different sets of events, two different plots going on at the same time. You could cut between them without completely explaining how they relate to each other, maybe until a certain point in the narrative, or not at all, right? So these are different possibilities for narrative structure. The important thing I think to remember is that narrative structure is up to you. You are not bound by any one kind of structure. You choose the structure just like you choose the point of view and perspective that works best for your story. And I'll just show you a very, very brief example of a narrative structure that is not chronological or linear, right? And this is called The Wife on Ambien, and you have a link to this too. And it basically just tells us all the things that the wife on Ambien, who's the character we're following, does at different points, right? Without saying that she does them in any kind of order. So it's kind of almost a slice of her life that we get to see at different points without moving from point A to point Z in time. Okay? So again, to reiterate, when you choose to write your story, you are going to probably have to choose a narrative point of view that is a first person, second person, or third person, and then a perspective to go along with that. If it's first person, the perspective is obvious. It's that person who's telling the story. But if it's third person, it can be within that no character's thoughts, one character's thoughts, a couple of characters' thoughts, or all of the characters' thoughts at different times, and even more knowledge than any of the characters has if it's omniscient, right? So point of view, perspective, and structure having to do with time. You make those choices and you'd be willing to experiment to see how those choices work out.